The invisible pandemic. The better title should have been Invincible Pandemic. Last week, I had a 30-year-old lady with blood cancer. We gave her intensive chemotherapy. After chemotherapy for several weeks, cancer patient will not be having any immunity. They are at risk of all kinds of infections. This patient developed fever as expected. After a few days, we grew a bacteria in the blood that is resistant to most of the available antibiotics in the hospital. We call it as superbug. We gave her one antibiotic that is active. The fever did not settle. And after a week, we grew the same bacteria that is resistant to all available antibiotics in the modern medicine armamentarium. We can call it as a superbug or pan-drug-resistant infection. Every day, I treat many patients with superbug infections and once in a while with the pan-drug-resistant infections. All Indian hospitals have such infections. Every Indian hospital, most hospitals in South Asia, and most other countries. It's a real global challenge, and we are living in 21st century with all the wonders of modern medicine. And we don't have antibiotics to treat common infections. We give cancer chemotherapy, we do transplant, we do intensive care, we have got all the technology, all the machines available in the medical field, but we don't have simple antibiotics to treat infections. David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, made a statement. The modern medicine without antibiotics, the modern medicine cannot function, and we will go back to the dark ages of civilization. Why are politicians making such statements? Doctors should be making such statements, isn't it? It's a scientific topic. And is it really a political topic? Is it really an economic topic? It is. Antimicrobial resistance. So what is antimicrobial resistance? Antibiotic resistance means antibiotics can't kill the bacteria. Anti-TB drug resistance means TB drugs are not active against TB bacteria. HIV drug resistance means HIV drugs are not active against HIV virus. Anti-malarial drug resistance is drugs are not working against malaria. So all these infections, if these anti-infectives are not active against the bug, we call it as antimicrobial. Microbe means the bug. Antimicrobial resistance. It's a big entity. As per the United Nations, antimicrobial resistance is one of the biggest challenges the world is facing today. As per the World Economy Forum, it's one of the biggest economic challenges the world is facing today. Economists are worried about, not just the doctors, policymakers are worried, politicians are worried about antimicrobial resistance because without antibiotics, the modern medicine can't function. Antibiotics are the cornerstone of modern medicine. Without modern medicine, the modern civilization cannot function. As per Lord Jim O'Neill is a former UK Treasury Secretary, one of the world famous economists. As per Lord Jim O'Neill and his team, they published a series of publications on antimicrobial resistance. As per Lord Jim O'Neill, the global economy will lose $100 trillion by 2050 because of antimicrobial resistance. Around the world, every year, 10 million people, that is 1 crore people will die because of antimicrobial resistance alone, every year till 2050. That's why it's not just a medical topic. It's a socio-political and economic topic. So what led us to this scenario? The most important reason, irrational antibiotic usage by medical community in hospitals and general practice. One of the important causes. And number 2, patients buy antibiotics over the counter without prescription. We call it as over the counter sale of antibiotic without prescription. OTC sale without prescription. And then the most important, Antibiotics are used as growth promoters in poultry industry, cattle farming, fish farming. Do you know that 70% of the antibiotics manufactured by the global pharmaceutical industry are used for growth promotional usage in animals? Growth promotional usage means not to treat infection, not to prevent infection. You give antibiotics to animals. You mix antibiotics in animal feed and feed it to animals, they grow fat and fast. And 70% of the antibiotic manufactured in the world are used purely for growth promotional usage. One of the most popular antibiotic is called as Colistin, and Colistin is the antibiotic we use in hospital to treat superbug infection. That Colistin is mixed in animal feed and fed to chicken, fish, pig, cattle across the world. So it's not just because doctors are overusing antibiotic, it's because patients are buying antibiotic without prescription and veterinarians and farmers are misusing antibiotics. One end, we create the superbug for misuse of antibiotics in animals and humans. On the other end, the lack of sanitation, lack of cleanliness in hospitals spread these superbugs from patient to patient, from surface to patient, doctor to patient. That's how the bacteria superbugs spread in hospitals. And lack of sanitation in the community spread these superbugs in water, river, pond, and everywhere. One of the most important causes of antimicrobial resistance in the developing world is inadequate sanitation scenario. And then the pharmaceutical industry is to blame. Pharmaceutical industry find antibiotics not to be really profitable. The reason is you invest $1 billion to develop an antibiotic and 10 years to develop it and market it. Experts say don't use that antibiotic because if you use it more, it becomes resistant. It loses efficacy. Can you ask a car manufacturer to invest billions, market it, and don't use it, don't use it? Which industry will invest in a molecule which after marketing people say, don't use it? That's a problem with antibiotics and many other anti-infective. So pharmaceutical industry is not interested in developing or investing in antibiotic. They invest in cholesterol drug and cardiac drug and other drugs where they can make profit forever and ever. So that's why we call it as, now how to tackle it? How to tackle the antimicrobial resistance? First, we have to rationalize antibiotic usage in the hospitals. We have to stop the OTC, over-the-counter sale of antibiotics. We have to stop the practice of farmers mixing antibiotics in animal feeds to reduce the generation of resistance. We have to improve the sanitation and infection control infrastructure in Indian hospitals. We have to improve the sanitation scenario in our country. We have to inspire the pharmaceutical industry in India and across the world to develop new antibiotics. Can doctors do it? Can doctors do any of these components except rationalizing antibiotic usage in the hospital? And there is more and more evidence that this is only one of the components. The most important component is sanitation in the community and cleanliness in hospitals. That's why we call it as a socio-political and economic challenge, not just a technical challenge anymore, not just a scientific challenge anymore. We cannot tackle AMR, antimicrobial resistance, unless we have the cooperation of the public, the media, the politicians, and the policymakers. Thank you.
Thanks. It's always such a pleasure to speak with my friend Abdul, who speaks with such passion and is such an international authority on the subject of antibiotic resistance in general. I'm going to be a bit more specific and speak about antimicrobial resistance in just one disease, and that's tuberculosis. So imagine if you picked up tomorrow's Times of India or Bombay Mirror, and the WHO had announced that a new highly infectious airborne disease would claim 2 million lives over the next year. And that they went on to say that there was no vaccine, that there were weak drugs, there was lengthy treatment, and there were high odds of developing lethal MDR strains. Of course, the world leaders would be galvanized into action immediately. And this is not fiction. It's what's been happening over the decades without fail and describing a disease that's as old as mankind, tuberculosis. MTB is really, Mycobacterium tuberculosis is really the perfect assassin. It's an obligate human pathogen. It's ancient and persistent over the millennia. It's airborne, and that means none of you in this room are immune to it. Its history is interwoven with the history of mankind, with the history of travel and migration, and it's the single greatest cause of mortality from any pathogen, period. So look, this cartoon shows that there were 1 billion deaths from TB over the last 2 centuries alone. And that dwarfs the number of deaths combined from all the other killers you've heard of. Smallpox, malaria, plague, influenza, cholera, AIDS combined were far less than that big orange circle. Antoine Portal was the physician to Napoleon Bonaparte, and he said there is no more dangerous disease than tuberculosis, and none so common. It destroys a very great part of the human race. Look at this exalted roster, if you will, of the great and famous. Famous artists, famous musicians, famous poets. What do they have in common? They have in common that they were all gifted and supremely talented, that they died in their 20s and 30s, and on their gravestones, the cause of death really was tuberculosis. This bred the erroneous and rather romantic belief that there was something grand and noble in dying from TB. Truth being told, there is no more dreadful way to die than from tuberculosis. It was called consumption in those days because we didn't know it was caused by a mycobacteria, and you were literally consumed from within. You withered away. It started off insidiously with a fever and cough and sweats. You lost weight, gradually got ill. And when you felt sure that the patient would and should die, they just hung on, almost as though they had no energy even to die themselves. It was truly a dreadful way to end. In fact, at one stage, 1 out of 4 deaths in the developed world, we're talking of Europe and America, were TB deaths. That's a staggering figure. 25% of people in the 1800s died of tuberculosis. And all the tragedy of consumption and all the ignorance of 19th century medicine is encapsulated in the death of this great romantic poet who died at the age of just 25, John Keats. I'm not sure if you know, but he was a medical student and a doctor at Guy's Hospital before he died, and that is Guy's Hospital, up there in the early 1800s, and that is a statue to John Keats which stands to this day. And look at the treatment that medicine at the time could offer him, medicine which almost certainly must have added to his hasty demise. But that was all we had, and that is a true prescription. It was exercise on horseback twice a day. It was bloodletting via leeches, and it was a solitary anchovy on bread, because at that time starvation was the fad. Over the centuries, there was no treatment apart from prayer, quackery, and pseudoscience for this disease. And the author of Sherlock Holmes said, as his wife lay dying of this disease, "What an infernal microbe it is. Surely science will find some way of destroying it." Well, we had 2 first-line drugs, if I may use that word, Abdul. At the time, we had leeches and we had bloodletting. And we had many second-line drugs, a steady parade of overhyped cures, each one more ridiculous than the next. I think it tells you of the desperation of the patient, and imagine their agony as they went through one fad cure after the other. And if I had to choose, I think I would choose Parker's tonic because it contains the same amount of alcohol as my malt whiskey. So that would have been my preferred medicine if I had it at the time. And at least they had rooms with a view because patients were laid out in sanatoriums because cold air was supposed to be believed to be good for these patients. And look at the date. This is less than 100 years ago when there were no TB drugs. And maybe we'll get back to that day one day if we run out of all antibiotics as is predicted. But they had this lovely view of the Houses of Parliament as they lay across the Thames. And then the dawn of this one drug, streptomycin, changed it all. Effective treatment of TB started with the advent of streptomycin. This was the first controlled trial in the history of medicine, not just in the history of TB, but in the history of medicine. You'd think that there would be this mad rush to get this wonder drug when there were millions of TB patients in the world. But the British, using their sense of justice and fair play, really decided to have a controlled trial. So half the eager patients were given the new wonder drug and half were just given bed rest because there was no placebo. Placebo was just, that was the standard treatment at the time. And the results were illuminating but heartbreaking. And the first portend of drug resistance came out here actually, that patients who received streptomycin got well for the first time ever in history. But 85% relapsed with strep-resistant TB, the first hint of drug resistance along the way. And Sir John Crofton, who I knew personally and has written many textbooks and who passed away recently, was a young registrar at the time. And he said, I saw the initial dramatic improvement in the strep group, but their subsequent deterioration when the bacilli became drug resistance. And over 70 years, we've learned that 2 drugs are good and 3 drugs are better and 4 drugs are the best. And now for TB, we have this standard combination of 4 drugs for standard TB, simple sensitive TB. But then things changed. The bacilli are always one step ahead. MDR described first, XDR, and 123 countries globally have it. So it's not an India-specific problem. And in this country, it exists on an epic scale. I don't want to numb you with numbers, but they are overwhelming. So it is a huge problem. It's our biggest public health problem. The majority of the world's drug-resistant cases lie in this country. And if you zoom in, that's just the tip of the iceberg because we don't test all our patients. So any statistics in this country are watered down. Now, this is a more accurate map of the world because it's a world map scientifically drawn according to TB deaths. And you can see how India finally becomes the superpower she's dreamed of being, and Africa as well. And you can see, interestingly, how Europe and America are banished to the periphery of the world. And can you guess how many XDR patients there were in all of America last year? 2 in all of the United States. I don't know how many we see in an average clinic at the Hinduja. Kishore is here and he will vouch that it's in double figures every single clinic. And look, that map is superimposed, the world TB death map, on the poverty map because TB is still a disease of poverty. And as the great Paul Farmer said, the poor have no option but to be at risk of tuberculosis. We seem to have standard TB licked quite easily. We've given them a standard set of the 4 drugs I mentioned for 6 months. This is assuming that they are sensitive to the drugs, but not when it comes to MDR TB, which is a much more complex process. Look, it's a 2-year course. How many of you can think of any course which goes on for 2 years and no guarantee of success at the end of it? Cure rates at the end of 2 years, 40 to 50%. Extremely expensive, debilitating side effects, crippling side effects, neuropathies, kidney failure, psychosis, resulting in suicide, and therefore high default rates as well. 60 million Indians were forced into poverty because they could not meet healthcare costs. The mean cost of treating a drug-sensitive patient is $50, and that's the most health-effective benefit you could be giving a patient. If you were in charge of policy in a country, nothing would be more effective than investing in drug-sensitive TB. You would make for every $1 invested about $15 to $20 in terms of health economic gain. Look at the cost of treating MDR TB in a country like New Zealand. This is a case report where they said it took $300,000 to cure one New Zealander of his MDR TB. At the Hinduja Hospital, we've struggled to do that for a fraction of the cost, but we still cannot get it down to below $5,000. But even that cost averages 230% of our patients' income. So not only is TB a disease of poverty, but it leaves in its wake poverty as well. We see families wiped out, selling jewelry, selling homes, selling cattle to try and cure themselves of this disease with no happy outcome guaranteed. And it's especially devastating in our country for many reasons, which I don't have time to go to, but maybe we will discuss later on. We have, therefore, this large expanding population of drug-resistant patients. They are accorded the status of untreatable and untouchable. There's not much fun being a TB doctor. When I was a resident in the UK, the chap I shared a flat with told me jokingly, Zarir, I want to become a specialist in diseases of the rich. It was my lot to become a specialist in diseases of the poor, because there is not much fun and no money to be made, of course, in treating these patients. But I want to pause for a minute and talk about a patient who changed me. This was a young boy called Zubin Irani. He was my first patient with MDR. I'd come back from extensive training in the UK. I had seen all of 0 patients in my 5 years of training there. He was a hemophiliac. He was an architecture student. He was intelligent, brave, talented, supremely creative. He drew beautifully, and he was a poet. He contracted TB in 1985, and despite years of treatment, was not responding. This is quite a historic drug sensitivity test that his mum, because look at the date. His mum gave this to me some years ago. This was 1988. I can find no reference of MDR at that stage. Most people would date MDR TB to 1990, 1991. So Zubin was probably one of the first MDR TB patients globally. I had no idea how to treat him. I wrote to experts from all over the world. You don't have Google in those days. You didn't have email in those days. I wrote to everyone I could think of and really made friends in the community and invited to write chapters with them later on, invited to conferences. This patient changed my life really and set me off on my future course. We tried every available drug to save Zubin, including an experimental vaccine which someone kindly flew down for us, but eventually he died of lung hemorrhage. He spent his last years mainly in the Parsi General Hospital, and this is the beautiful sketch, it's a bit blurred, that he drew of the hospital. And I won't read this, his mum's introduction to the poems that he wrote, but he says, perhaps facing death continuously like Zubin has, his writings were his way to stay sane. And since Zubin, we've seen many, many worse patterns of resistance and ominous progression, an alphabet soup of resistance, as I put it, from simple TB to MDR. In layman's terms, 2 drugs don't work, as Abdul said, to XDR, which sounds pornographic but means 4 drugs don't work, and then the TDR strains we described in 2011. And really, considering the haphazard wave we've been prescribing drugs, and as Abdul has told you, that is the main driver of resistance. It's an iatrogenic disease. It's a man-made disease. It was no surprise, or should have been no surprise, when we first described TDR, as we called it, and I will admit now in retrospect that perhaps that was not the right word to give it. Because no one is totally drug resistant, because new drugs may come and you never know what's going to happen. Anyway, we defined it as we saw it. The patients were resistant to all 12 drugs available at the time. So super bug, if you want to call it, Abdul. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it shook up TB control in this country. Maybe giving it that catchy title attracted attention to it. It brought drug-resistant TB out of the closet, and it focused a lot of international, local, layman's attention on this one disease. In fact, I began to think that TDR, including one of my patients who made the cover of Time and who died shortly after, and I began to wonder if TDR really stood for triggering dramatic response instead of totally drug resistant, because it really raised up this storm. I don't have time to go into details, but this is the prototype of the patients we described in that article. A 37-year-old lady from Dharavi. So your ears should pick up at that stage. It's Asia's largest slum with this unimaginable population density. And think of it, we have airborne diseases which spread wildly there. So it's not an exaggeration to say that we're sitting on an epidemic. She'd had TB for 5 years. She'd consulted multiple doctors, received multiple drugs, more than 60 months. What's more soul-destroying than taking more than 60 months? You talked of, I put up my hand when they said, how many of you have not finished 1 week of antibiotics? This is 60 months. And then when things go wrong, we blame the patient. We say, oh, you're a treatment failure. That is medical euphemism for a patient who doesn't get better. We put the blame on the patient. We say, you are a treatment failure, without wondering why the patient has failed. She'd flitted between government and private and government, crisscrossing the 2 circuits, taken every possible drug, multiple doctors, every possible drug, never a sensitivity test, and that was what we labeled her, with reason, totally drug resistant. You can see the drugs on one side, and you can see the red resistance that she was to each and every available drug. She died after a surgery, and really, if I was an evil dictator wanting to create an epidemic of TB in this country, drug resistance, I would do what we're doing in our country. You would create a social and economic climate of poverty and inequity. You'd subject TB patients to squalid, overcrowding living conditions. Think Bombay, 50% of Bombay is slumland. Patients have no permanent abode. You'd provide inadequate treatment and erratic treatment. As Abdul told you, that's a guarantor of drug resistance. And then we're not even speaking about adding HIV to this cauldron, which makes it all that much more difficult. How did we get here? The Indian MDR TB patient is trapped between the vortices, the twin vortices of two competing systems. There is the private sector, and although I'm part of it, I have to admit it's often exploitative and unregulated. I have to admit that. And we have the program which plods along, which has done a great job, the government program, of treating the standard drug-sensitive patients, but has let down the MDR TB patients in a big way, and in many ways may actually be amplifying resistance. So a patient like this villager who came to see me, and when you look at him, you know that he's too late to help, isn't it? He's too far gone, basically. Even if there was a wonder drug, we would not have been able to get him right. But he has the Faustian choice of either going private or public. So if he goes private, he encounters this huge, unengaged, unregulated, exploitative sector. 80% of healthcare in this country is private. Why is that? It must be a reflection on what the public sector is like. If patients choose, even the poor ones, choose to go private. Private sector doctors outnumber public doctors, 13-1. We have a whole host of alternative faiths. Ayush means Ayurveds, Unani, homeopathic, all competing for your patient's attention. And patient shopping is a wonderful Indian trait. They will go from doctor to doctor and then not listen to any of them. Most of the private doctors, including the homeopaths, are happy to take on the patient initially, worsen him with a bad prescription, and then leave the baby to the rest of us. This is the signpost of one such doctor. I think he means physician and surgeon, but he says physical and surging, and at least he's dynamic, and he's got degrees that the Royal College of Physicians would not approve of. The patients then end up, this is the scene outside my passage. My door is somewhere here. If you want the highest incidence of TB germs around you, I think it is the corridor outside my room at the Hinduja Hospital. Some of you have been, some of you work there. Public sector is partly to blame. We have chronically underinvested in health, haven't we? Less than 1% GDP, always. And the program is an underperforming, underfunded, and extremely stretched program. You have no idea of the number of patients who visit DOTS clinic across the country. The staff is poorly paid, they're stretched, bureaucracy, drugs are substandard, all contributing to its poor perception. And this looks like a tortuous Venn diagram, but it's the path that 100 patients take as they flit from doctor to doctor, private to public, chemist to public, and it's a complicated graph and maze which these authors have published in PLOS ONE recently. So if I had to conclude, I would say that the emergence of MDR TB has threatened the progress made in standard TB over the last few decades. And look, when we talk about standard TB, we happily say 6 months is short course chemotherapy. Since when did 6 months become short course? That we are happy with that. It exceeds the treatment duration of most other infectious diseases I know. Cure rates of 40% in XDR TB. When did they become acceptable? We're almost happy when we cure a patient, but that is the success rate. They replicate actually pre-chemo cure rates. Not everyone died of TB. People survived with immunity and just lingered on sometimes. Every patient is worth fighting for is my personal philosophy, regardless of their pattern, whether it shows resistance to 10, 12 or more drugs. Sadly, however, a disease can only be treated with the drugs available. Abdul mentioned Colistin as the last resort antibiotic in general infections. And every day at the Hinduja ICU, we see patients who are resistant to every antibiotic, including Colistin. Those days are here. This is not an alarmist call, it's a wake-up call. We need new drugs for the therapeutically destitute patient. We need new regimes, and we need them now. If I was an activist, I would be saying that. Until then, as you've heard, responsible use of our existing resources will safeguard the emergence of resistance. And just a few weeks ago, there is always hope. So again, wrong to say anyone is totally drug resistant. This came out in every single major newspaper, from the New York Times to the Times of India to the Wall Street Journal. A new dose of hope in XDR, a new regime, predominant bedaquiline linezolid, which achieved 80% success rates in this very small sample size of 100 patients. Not replicated, but there is always hope. And therefore, as the great Ibn Sina said 1,000 years ago, remember, there are no incurable diseases, there is just lack of will. I'm not going to go over this, but maybe we can touch on some of my wish list points in the discussion, and I will end here, and we'll be happy to take the Q&A. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you to the Asia Society for inviting me to moderate this wonderful panel discussion. One line was missing in my introduction. I'm a microbiologist turned journalist. So it is, yes. So, the microbes seem to be winning the battle. So my first question, and since we have laid out the background and the problems and the challenges, I think it's time to talk about solutions. And we had both doctors talk about it being a super bug. So maybe we need a super hero to fight the super bug, right? So, when you have Superman, there's a super villain. So who do you think here can be the super hero? Do we need someone from Bollywood, maybe a TB survivor from Bollywood to kind of become a role model? Because, and I think that instead of having a Bollywood person, a Bollywood survivor as a superstar, I think you have your own survivors in the audience who can be made into superstars. So Dr. Zarir, if you have your...
No, she's not come, sorry. But there is a woman who on whose paper I always write Superwoman. She comes to me from Indore. She got MDR TB in the brain, which is the worst possible site to have it in. Her husband, who she'd been married to for 6 months, promptly abandoned her. And we don't even talked about the stigmatization that goes into TB, but there is a huge amount of gender discrimination and stigmatization. And her brother took over the reins, and he said he might try and be here, but unfortunately he's not. So they are the superheroes, really, the people who've gone through this arduous 2-year regime, and which would make any mortal fold up and come out on top.
True, and one reason that they're not here probably in the audience is again what you brought up, the stigma, and TB is, probably the most stigmatized disease, probably after HIV. And when the HIV pandemic was also, discovered and things like that, the general, reaction was, oh, HIV doesn't happen to people like us. And then suddenly after 1 year, we realized that yes, it does happen to people like us. That's the same case with TB. You realize that no, TB is not a disease. TB is a disease of the poor people. But it's not that way. Everybody, every one of us is going to know a TB patient because we harbor the germs in our body ourselves. It's a latent infection in India. So, for instance, my first brush with a patient from TB was one of your patients, and a very sad case. Got into IIT. My son happened to be in the 10th standard that time. He was studying for the 12th at the same time, and my son was going to his mother for tuitions, and we were shocked. The boy got into IIT, and then, we heard 2 months later that he passed away. So, TB is, and how did he catch it? He was, from a South Indian family, very good nutrition, etc., very careful, very good sanitation standards. He picked it up probably from his driver. So it's wrong to say that, we are insulated from these kind of diseases. Dr. Abdul, you were part of the Chennai Declaration. It was launched in 2013. 2017, we have the national policy of AMR that has been released. How many states have their state policies? And so can we look at the government as a superhero, really, in AMR or MDR TB?
In 2011, we prepared the national antibiotic policy for the country. But we didn't really do much to implement that policy. So in 2012, we called all the medical societies, government representatives, and other stakeholders and prepared the Chennai Declaration. And after that, we communicated, especially the Union Health Ministry, and we mobilized a lot of action after that, especially among medical societies. And similar action by various other societies, various initiatives, similar initiatives across the world resulted in 2015, the World Health Organization released the World Health WHO AMR, Antimicrobial Resistance Global Action Plan. And 194 countries signed up to the WHO Global AMR Action Plan. And as per the Global Action Plan, by 2017, all countries should release their National Action Plan. In 2017, we prepared the National Action Plan, and we had a plan. All Indian states should prepare the State Action Plan. In India, health is predominantly a state topic. So, union government prepare the policies and states have to implement it. Till today, only 2 states have released State Action Plan. 2 years, 2017, 2019. Now today India has 28 states and 9 union territories. Out of it, only 2 released the State Action Plan, Kerala last year and Madhya Pradesh 2 weeks ago. What happened to other states? We have come a long way at national level and global level, but very limited success. India is a country with 1.3 billion population, 1 million doctors, 500,000 pharmacies, 75,000 hospitals, and so many states. Socio-economic disparity, sanitation issue, political issues. States are ruled by different political parties than the center. It's a very, very complicated scenario. We have reached only very limited success in implementing India's National Action Plan.
So the answer probably does not lie with the government. The government has failed to be the hero or the superhero that it should be. So maybe from the audience, before I go around asking questions here from the audience, I saw someone raising their hand. Would anyone want to throw in their solutions? What could be their solutions? Can we have mics, please?
Hi, I have 2 points to make. One is that the pharmaceutical industry has been well known to incentivize doctors to prescribe medications, whether it is antibiotics or any other drugs, when actually the patient may not need them. That also is one of the causes for antibiotic resistance. The second is a lot of doctors, and I'm not generalizing across the board, but a lot of doctors offer symptomatic treatment. So you have fever, prescribe an antibiotic. There is no diagnosis per se, and that also leads to antibiotic resistance. Basic antibiotics, the first generation ones, whether it's erythromycin, ampicillin, amoxicillin, which could work, are not prescribed these days by most doctors. They straight away prescribe the high-end antibiotics, and for some well-educated people like us who question the doctors, the answer is always that those don't work anymore. So what would you have to say about these things? Yeah, please.
So there was this, that's a very good point. There was this colleague, there is this colleague called Madhu Pai, who's a famous professor of TB in Canada. He trained 50 actors, lay people, to enact classic symptoms of TB, trained them well. So they said, doctor, I've got fever, night sweats, I've lost 10 kilos of weight. I mean, even the cobbler on the road would have said, think about TB. And he sent them to different doctors in 2 different states. And he found delay upon delay in diagnosing this one disease, which should have been the first on any doctor's diagnostic list. He added up the total duration of delays. It came to about 3 months. He sent them with x-rays which were of other patients, classic TB x-rays. They still didn't latch on. So a lot of it has to training and then insisting on standards in our medical professionals at the public and the private levels.
And since we are talking about solutions, I mean, what can we as the lay public, do to, check on what our doctor's giving us? I mean, we often consult Dr. Google to, diagnose our own symptoms. But what about when we get a prescription? I have a wonderful GP who tells me that, if your symptoms don't disappear, don't go away in 3 days, if you just got a cough, cold, do your gargling, do your steam inhalations. If they don't go away in 3 days, then you take this. If they don't go away in 5 days, you do this. Now, I do follow that, but not every GP is going to do that, So, as a patient, do you think that, there is anything that we can do when a doctor tells us first off, do this, or do we just go ahead with the prescription? How do you, if any one of you all want to take that question.
As I said, there are standard guidelines which should be followed. For example, it is policy that anyone who's coughing for more than 2 weeks, because that takes care of the general viral cough which should have settled by then, in our part of the world should go to a doctor, should have an x-ray, should have a sputum sent off. So if something as basic as that was followed, you'd be able to triage your patients, and treat them accordingly. But seldom is that done, sadly.
Okay. I think we have a couple of questions from this side of the audience. 3 this side. Finally,
Good evening, doctors. Very powerful talk, fact-based. My compliments. Dr. Udwadia, this question is for you. How long do you think is the journey for an MDR patient from the time of having his first symptoms to actually getting initiated on treatment? That's part 1. Part 2, we all speak about challenges. You spoke about challenges, and there are multiple things that can be done. What are those quick wins that the key stakeholders in the system, that's the government and clinicians, private clinicians like you, that can be done, that change the situation?
Well, the first question should really be answered by Nargish Mistry, who's in the audience. Nargish is here? Yeah, Nargish, hi. And I think her study recently wonderful study showed the innumerable, in England they have this thing called mind the gap before you enter a train on the underground. The innumerable gaps that our patient had to negotiate, the average patient had to negotiate. But to simplify what she did, she showed that it takes about 6 months for an MDR patient from the first cough to the first drug getting into him. Now remember, he's living in a community with 20 people in the same room often. So it's not uncommon for the patient to then infect brother, sister, father, spouse. You follow. But was that right, Nagi? 6 months for MDR TB was the take-home message of how long it took our Indian doctors to get these patients sadly started on treatment. And they ceased to be infectious only after a few weeks or a few months of effective treatment. So all this delay only adds to the spread of the epidemic as well.
Thank you. Can we have some mics this side? A couple of...
Thank you. I might have a question to Dr. Ghafur. He spoke that that private companies don't have incentive to invent antibiotics because they are not much profit making like as other chronic disease. Is AMR plan talking about, or we can advocate to the government that at least research of antibiotics should be public funded so that we can reach to that a little earlier? And the second part is that doctor said that it takes time to diagnosis of 6 months or 3 months because of inadequate training. But most of the medical schools are still relying on the old teaching pattern. Can we advocate through Chennai Declaration and Medical Student Association problem-based learning in medical schools so that that this diagnosis thing can be taught at the school level itself, at the medical school?
Can Indian companies invest in antibiotic research? Can Indian government inspire the antibiotic drug development? Few years ago, I was talking to Dr. Yusuf Hamid, the chairman of CIPLA. Why shouldn't Indian companies invest in antibiotic drug development? His answer was very good. Even in the Western world, it's the government institutions do the early antibiotic drug development. After that, the pharmaceutical companies take over. So the Indian government should invest more in the early antibiotic drug development. A very good answer and a practical answer. Pharmaceutical companies find antibiotics not really profitable, but there are other ways. Now the economists are discussing about the push-pull strategies. One way is, yes, pharmaceutical company can develop the drug, and after that, if they develop a successful antibiotic that really useful, the governments, one government or the organizations or multiple governments can purchase that antibiotic and use it only when it is necessary. If a pharmaceutical company sell an antibiotic, they will always oversell because they have to get the investment back. But if governments purchase that antibiotic, they can use it rationally. There are various methodologies now the economists are looking into to solve this funding crisis of antibiotic drug development.
And again, going back to the TB model, what we invest, the national TB program in this country invests in TB control in this country, considering it's our #1 health problem, is really peanuts. We fall short by about $1.5 billion every year. We need that level of investment more if we want to make this program a well-functioning, efficient program.
Moving to the overall, we have one more question, and till the mics reach them. Moving to, AMR is a much bigger problem than the MDR TB. So, I mean, you're talking about do hospitals, have antibiotic stewardship programs in place, and how can we at home also, improve the standards of sanitation? Probably we'll take that after, since the mic has reached. I
used to see some ads called the DOTS program. Can you explain what is it and how effective it has been?
So DOTS, that's a good question. DOTS is Directly Observed Therapy Short Course. It is based on the premise that no one in their right minds is going to agree to take treatment for so long without lapsing. So 6 months is the short course regime, so-called short course regime. Each dose is given under supervision because patients lie. That's the hard fact at all levels, whatever their educational status. Okay, I put up my hand because I couldn't finish 7 days of antibiotics. So the DOTS program ensures that the drug is actually delivered. There's a person who actually watches and witnesses the swallowing of each drug. That's what it's meant to be. But many shortcuts have been taken. It's not very practical. And even if you watch everyone supervising drugs which they are resistant to, it's not going to help. So DOTS has been great for short course chemotherapy. It's been a very cost-effective global intervention. But in MDR TB, it's just not 2 years of supervision you follow, and the drugs are not there in the first place. But DOTS is based on the premise that you cannot trust the patient to take drugs when it's such a lengthy course.
Okay. We have a couple of more questions.
Thank you for the conversation. I actually was continuing with their question. I have one separate question. The RNTCP has now moved to daily DOTS. Daily DOTS supposedly should be a shorter course, but along with the stigma attached to it, they have to go to the urban primary health centers to receive them. People, because of the stigma, don't go to them. So what behavioral change communication is required in order to, incentivize people to move towards daily DOTS? And how would we ensure that the daily DOTS, from the very beginning, how do we ensure that the person is not drug resistant to the daily DOTS? That's my first question.
Let me do one at a time, otherwise I forget.
Sure.
Yeah. So the concept of DOTS can be very alienating for some people. In the West, they consider almost an infringement of patient autonomy. You can understand why a lady, for example, would be a bit hesitant, Indian lady, to go into a center which prominently says DOTS TB center because of the stigmatization attached to it. So we are moving to more sophisticated forms of DOTS. There is something called video DOTS where you can supervise long distance. A trusted house relative is allowed to administer the DOTS. So DOTS has to be more flexible. It was too rigid initially. For a daily wage earner, it was either go to the DOTS center or work and fill my stomach. And you know what the average human would choose. So DOTS is not a guarantor of compliance, and it has to be made more adaptable to the patient.
And my second question was, the Prime Minister just said that he wants to eradicate TB by 2025. Do you think it is reasonable in practice, practical?
So initially his comments used to amuse me, but now they anger me. Because the global community has said 2030, but our exalted Prime Minister has said 2025. Okay, that is just, in simple words, not going to happen. That's fantasy.
Can I just make a comment on that, Zarir?
Sure.
Why can't we take it in a different perspective? Now, Prime Minister wants us to eradicate TB by 2025. As a big TB expert, what do you want the Prime Minister to do to help you to eradicate TB?
Well, I can see which side of the political fence we're both on, Abdul. But I'll tell you what. We talked about one thing already. We talked about budgeting, for example. So you have to put your money where your talk is, right? As they say in the Western movies, our budget is derisory in terms of what it gives patients. There is this wonderful new test called the Gene Expert test. A Gene Expert test within 6 hours would be able to tell me if any of you in this room had MDR TB. In the old days, that took 6 to 8 weeks. So it's a game changer by any stretch of description. Yet there are no more than about a few thousand Gene Expert machines across the country. They should be as common as the bank teller cash dole-outs. So a lot more has to be done in terms of political will, in terms of investment. Those are the big intangibles. Then, of course, remember that antibiotic resistance, that TB control in the West, when did it start to improve? Before any drugs, but with general improvement after the Industrial Revolution in hygienic standards. We are not a very hygienic society. That goes without saying. We're not Singapore. And until the basic level of hygiene changes, that won't happen. We have the largest diabetic population in the world, and diabetes and TB are twin bedfellows. So considering the dynamics of all this, I'm being practical, not pessimistic, when I say that things are unlikely to change. We're 2020 already. So in 5 years, the kind of TB problem that we have is just not going to be eradicated, sadly.
I want to come back to my same question.
Yes.
In which, what are those quick wins? We know, seeking actives, physician shopping, setting up an LDA, clinical conviction. They're all practical gaps that exist today, and there are no quick wins. So if there has to be some small, we can't be choosers, but if we have to really choose and identify those quick interventions to make a meaningful difference in the next 2-3 years, what would that be?
I think you've named most of them, really. We've talked about quick diagnostics and availability. We've talked about budgeting and the needs. We've talked about training for doctors. We've talked about enforcing prescriptions as per guidelines, which would prevent the spread of resistance. We've not talked about accessibility to drugs. Patients of mine, there was a patient of mine who sued the High Court because the government would not give her this wonder drug called bedaquiline. Now imagine having a drug in front of your nose which would save your life, but the government said, no, we can't give it to you because of bureaucracy. She was from the wrong state, etc., etc. Her state was so backward that they didn't have the drug anywhere. Her father was a government employee. He sued, it's known as the Patna case. A great lawyer called Kapil Grover took it on pro bono. And argued that she should be given the drug, at which point the government said, the TB hospital said, we're not giving it, go to Dr. Udwadia and have it under his supervision. So this poor girl moved to New Bombay, where she rented a flat, and she came to take the drug under my supervision. She got cured of her TB. She became culture negative, but the delay resulted in her ending up on oxygen, and eventually she died about a month ago, although she had become culture negative. So the drug given at that time would have saved her. So new drugs are available. We talked about these wonder regimes. They will percolate very, very slowly in the country which most needs them. The company which makes bedaquiline has its factories in India, but you can't get the bedaquiline here for love of money. So it's government policy as well. You follow? Yes, prescribing antibiotics responsibly, but at the same time not putting your hand up in a desperate patient not giving the antibiotic they deserve.
Okay. So Dr. Ghafur, would you say that the Swachh Bharat campaign is a quick fix for the AMR policy to achieve low rates of antibiotic resistance, because it definitely is leading us to better sanitation and therefore less infection and therefore less antibiotic use?
We all thought irrational antibiotic usage, if we control it, we can bring down the resistance level. There's no doubt that antibiotic usage creates resistance. But a country like India has got very high levels of superbugs. If you want to control the superbug spread, the most important aspect is not rational antibiotic usage, it's improvement in the sanitation in the community and cleanliness of Indian hospitals. And people like me, the so-called expert like me, I have lost my belief in antibiotic stewardship. In 2013, we brought out a rule to control the over-the-counter sale of antibiotics, H1 rule, still not implemented across the country because we are not raising enough noise to get it implemented because we lost interest. In my opinion, the most important thing is sanitation. So in a country like India, the National AMR Action Plan must be rewritten and include Swachh Bharat Abhiyan as the most important component of controlling AMR in the country. Our concept of controlling antibiotic usage by proper usage of antibiotics is not right. We should change that to cleanliness in the hospital and sanitation in the community. And how can we improve the sanitation? We need better infrastructure, better funding. A recent study, if you use the antibiotic usage in India, Europe and America, The per capita antibiotic usage is lower in India than US and Europe. But antibiotic resistance is highest in India. In fact, it's just the opposite. The per capita antibiotic usage high in US, comparatively low resistance. India, per capita antibiotic usage low, but high resistance. But if you plot the graph in a different way, lower the sanitation, the higher the resistance. It's directly proportional. So, antimicrobial resistance, if you want to control, it is the sanitation. And how can we improve the sanitation? By better governance, lack of corruption, better infrastructure, and what we need is funding. Again, if you want to control the TB, raise noise. Let everybody ask the Prime Minister, we will control the TB by 2025, but where is the money for the TB control program? Why can't Indian citizens write to Prime Minister? We need fund to realize your big dream. Why can't doctors write? Why can't public write? Why can't media write? Why can't celebrities write to Prime Minister asking for fund for TB control program? Zarir, is something for you. Convince your big people in Mumbai. You have got big film stars. Let them ask Prime Minister. Let's realize your big dream.
None of the big film stars are my patients, but you're right, Abdul, and we have put our names. I'm tired of how many times I've put my signature to campaigns by groups who have petitioned the Prime Minister and Health Minister at every level. Do you think these are really read ever, or they would be read by a lackey and not considered as important as the Kashmir problem, for example? So, which we don't want to go into anyway.
Okay. What about the Redline Initiative? Has that made any impact? The Redline Initiative is about putting a red line on all antibiotics so that patients buying them at the chemist counter. How many here in this audience are aware of the Redline Initiative? So that's very less. There, I have, as the media, I take full responsibility for not making that making noise about that. But so obviously that has not worked. And how can, only two states, as you said, Dr. Ghafur, have their AMR policies in place. What real pressure can be brought on to the states, and why have they not put it into place?
Even these two states haven't implemented the OTC rule. Kerala, we released the action plan last year, but we haven't done anything. I'm a Keralite working in Chennai, but still I say we haven't done anything to control the over-the-counter sale of antibiotics. And Madhya Pradesh released it 2 weeks ago. It's just a paper policy. And over the country, we haven't done anything significantly to control the over-the-counter sale of antibiotics. The reason is, at union government level, we prepare policies. States have to implement. It's a responsibility of the states to implement it. So state government, state drug controller has to take action.
And what is the way forward? Any quick wins?
Talk to Maharashtra, health minister, drug controller, ask them to implement the over-the-counter sale rule. It's not that difficult. In 2011, when we prepared the first over-the-counter rule, we wrote that no antibiotic should be dispensed over-the-counter without prescription. And we withdrew that policy immediately. It's not possible in a country like India. In Indian villages, many villages are not doctors. So how can we write a policy that you can't dispense antibiotic without prescription? We realized our mistake immediately. Then in 2013, we rewrote the policy and we included 24 antibiotics only. Still, the first-line antibiotics can be bought over the counter without prescription. It's just the second and third line. It's easy to implement if we have the will. Again, it's the will that matters.
Thank you, Dr. Ghafur. Moving back to Dr. Zarir, I had interviewed you in November 2016, and at that time you had said, we were talking about India's tryst with TB, and you said India's case with TB is like that of the blind man and the elephant. Do you still feel that is the case, or is there any improvement, and what more improvements would you like to see from the government?
No, I said that with reference to the fact that, till the furor created by our total drug-resistant TB publication, TB was not even a notifiable disease in this country. Now that's appalling, because blind man and the elephant is we didn't know the extent of the problem. Surely you need to know, to make any policy work, first of all, what the extent of the problem is. So TB was not even notifiable. Now these days, since then, we have strict, so it's linked to your
TB
Aadhaar card or
registry,
whatever, and every TB patient mandatorily by law, and they're quite strict about this, I believe, has to be at least notified. So at least we will not be able to sweep the data under the carpet anymore and get an idea of the extent of the problem.
Yeah, I think we have quite a few questions from the audience.
If a person in a family has TB, is there any form of prophylaxis you can sort of advise his relatives and people living in that family to follow?
So that's a very good point. It's basic stuff like wearing a mask. A colleague of ours who works at Harvard, Nargish Nozimwal, showed that if the TB patient wears a mask, a thin paper mask, not a fancy mask, he or she will reduce transmission by 50%.
Yeah.
So that's such a simple medicine.
Yeah, can I just give an idea there? It's traditional and old knowledge, but silver is a terrific antimicrobial. And we've used, I used to be in Tata Chemicals, and we made a water filter of burnt rice husk, but we had to put some nano-silver particles in that to remove the bacteria completely. So we brought it down to sort of 99.9% pure by using nano-silver. I had come across technologies which people working on universities abroad where you can have a cream with nano-silver in it, and you coat your nostrils with it. So when you breathe in the air, it's purified. So you need innovative technologies like these again.
So there are levels of masks, wearing efficacies. Some of them are coated with special antimicrobacterial material. A simple measure like letting the sun in, letting the ventilation in. Our houses are so bad, our slums, our chawls are so badly ventilated. So it's little things like that which can help. And yes, there is preventive treatment you can offer, which is mandatory for kids. Kids are exquisitely prone to tuberculosis. Very, very prone to TB. So if the mother has TB, it's almost a given that the kid below the age of 5 will get it. And such kids should get prophylactic treatment as well.
Hello, good evening. Hi, so I'm a medical student and we have a couple of medical student representatives from Medical Student Association of India. So I just wanted to know, we've covered major stakeholders who contribute to antimicrobial resistance. I just wanted to know what can we as medical students do to contribute to this pandemic, and because we don't have a lot of topics on AMR, but we do cover extensively about tuberculosis and the drug resistance in our curriculum, but not on antimicrobial resistance. So just wanted a few suggestions as medical students, what can we contribute towards in the pandemic?
The Indian medical curriculum doesn't give significance to antibiotic usage or antimicrobial resistance. So when the new NMC come into reality, write to the NMC and ask them to include antimicrobial resistance in every year in undergraduate and postgraduate medical curriculum. It's not your fault. It's not the fault of the medical community. In fact, in 2010, I wrote an editorial in Journal of Association of Physicians of India, an obituary on the death of antibiotic. And I criticized the Indian medical community so badly, tough words. I thought Indian medical community should be ashamed of the superbugs in the country. Today, I'm really sorry for that article. The reason is, it's not just the medical community. At that time, I thought we doctors are the most important stakeholders of AMR. We are not. The doctors contribute only a minor role in the whole saga of antimicrobial resistance. Still, we are the people who write it. So we should be aware of the antibiotics and proper usage of antibiotics. Indian medical curriculum for undergraduates and postgraduates should include detailed descriptions of antibiotic usage. So as Medical Students Association, write to NMC. Ask them to teach you on antibiotic usage.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is AMR as prevalent in other illnesses like sepsis, post-op infections, other lung infections as it is in TB? And is MRSA a problem over here, MRSA?
MRSA is a problem in some centers like orthopedic centers and many Western countries. In a country like India, its other group, the gram-negative bacteria, is a major problem. MRSA belongs to the gram-positive category. Yes, it's a problem in India, but the main problem is gram-negative bacterial resistance. And if you look at the number of antibiotics available to treat MRSA, today I have at least 5 or 6 antibiotics to treat MRSA. And if you have 5 antibiotics, that bug is not a superbug, in my opinion. Where we have many resistant gram-negative superbug, where 1 antibiotic is available or no antibiotic is available. So in developing world, it's predominantly the gram-negative bacteria.
Yeah, 1 minute. There's, yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm a student at KM Hospital. So you spoke about sanitation and cleanliness in hospitals. It would be easier to do that in private hospitals, but how do we do that in a public hospital where almost every patient suffers from tuberculosis and the patient load is enormous?
Funding. So currently, as Dr. Zarir mentioned, the India 1.25% is the healthcare budget. And government plan to increase it to 5% over the next 5 years. I don't think it's really going to happen. Again, if you want something to happen, raise voice with your state government, convince your politicians, and your medical students, you have got a big voice. Why can't you, all the medical students in the country, raise voice and say, we need to increase our national health budget to 5% in 3 years? It may happen. That's the only solution. Without funding, without facilities, you can't practice infection control and you can't do anything.
So on individual basis, what can we do? Because I have colleagues who have encountered TB because they are healthy, but so many patients around, healthy students, and they are life-threatening disease. So what do we do on individual level?
Yeah, to be honest, I've lost count of the number of doctors, nurses, physiotherapists who consult me for drug-resistant TB. If it's such a population in the community, doctors are first line to get it. So it is a huge problem in our medical personnel. And as you know, doctors also make the worst patients, the least compliant patients often, sadly, although they know details about the disease. But I want to just ask Abdul one question. Tell us, you've done some great work on the cattle problem with Colistin. Could you tell us a little? I don't know too much about it myself, Abdul, the Colistin cattle controversy, and that seems to be a simple measure that you can adopt. Just pass a ruling that you cannot use it in cattle feed. What's the problem with that?
Colistin is the last resort antibiotic in the human practice, and that colistin is extensively used as a growth promoter in India and many other countries. And for the last 2 years, we have been communicating with the Union Health Ministry to ban the colistin usage as a growth promoter in the poultry field. And what we found was 95% of the colistin used in poultry is imported from China, and China has banned it in 2017, but still exporting to India and other countries. So but we didn't have data in the country on the presence of colistin-resistant bacteria. So what we did 2 years ago, we took samples from various supermarkets in Chennai, vegetables, chicken, and other samples. We found 50% of the samples were positive for colistin-resistant bacteria. These raw chicken, vegetables, and most of the food materials had this bacteria. And day and night we are eating this food, and many of our gut will be colonized with these bacteria. And you get admitted to a hospital, colistin won't work. So we use the data, we convince the government, and that convincing is not an easy job. The Indian poultry industry is 60,000 crore industry. And Indian veterinary pharmaceutical industry, this growth promoter industry is very strong. There was very serious opposition from poultry industry and the antibiotics lobby. We have to bypass all these lobbies. Finally, we convinced that China has banned it and they're dumping colistin in India. That worked. That part worked. And we put pressure on China, and also we could convince all the stakeholders, and that's how the ban really happened. If you want to get anything done in this country, you need to be political. You need to follow the political strategy, find the weak point of the politicians, catch on that, convince them to change the rule. But now we need to get that implemented. It's maybe easier than the over-the-counter rule because it's easy to track the colistin import. Even you can log into a website and you know every month, if you can log into a website, you can know the import of colistin or anything else to our country. And if there's a rule, the importers, the business people will not be very keen in importing a drug that is banned in our country and get caught and punished. So I think they will, and Commerce Ministry has a plan to track the import. So probably we are confident in this particular rule will be implemented in the country. Let's wait for a year and see what happens.
Okay. So we've heard of nosocomial infections contracted at hospitals, as well as liquid biomedical waste effluents leading to antimicrobial resistance. Does the AMR bill have any provisions on how to deal with biomedical waste and not contribute to antimicrobial resistance? Thank you.
There is a national rule and state rules to manage biomedical waste. And that is pretty implemented in at least NABH accredited hospitals. So again, out of 75,000 hospitals in the country, only 500 are NABH accredited. We don't even know whether majority of the hospital follow biomedical waste rules. We don't even know the infection control practice and standards of these hospitals. We don't have the data.
Yeah, please. It's a mix between a comment and a question. We know that there are, in India, we're looking at a lot of youth population under 30. And then on the other hand, we also know the RNTCP has huge volumes of patients. And the thing that I think links these two things is technology. But I don't see a lot of technology still being implemented by RNTCP in their regular follow-ups. So I just wanted to know your opinion on how you think technology can be used to improve. We also spoke about DOTS and daily DOTS and patients having to come every single day to health facility. Why isn't technology being looked at more just beyond video dots?
I think, to be fair, it is gradually extending its reach. For example, they have now on the TB drug packets that they give to each patient a scratch, like you scratch out a facility, and a number that is dialed, and you know that the patient has or has not taken the drug. Yeah. That's right. So, yeah, for drug-sensitive patients. For MDR TB, it's always much more complex. But video dots is an example, and
but it would make sense to do it for DR when you know it's 2 years.
Absolutely.
And it's longer and there is more burden of the treatment.
If you can use the mic. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Question before you.
Okay, I just have one question. There's been a recent discussion on starting a course for non-medical people to practice as doctors, given a short duration of, it's not like an MBBS degree, but as an alternate degree. Do you think that is going to accelerate this problem of AMR or anti-TB resistance, or is it going to help reduce it?
Look, I can train a monkey to become a doctor, honestly. It's not difficult. You don't need great rocket science brains, really. So if you can train someone, and a Bangladesh model, for example, where they have a huge cadre of very well-trained non-MBBS people, I think it's something that we should reach out for. Of course, it goes with the proviso that these people are genuinely well-trained, know their limitations, and follow standards. Because there are remote parts of the country without access to any medical doctor at all. So I am for it, actually.
Dr. Ghafur, your comment?
Yeah. Me too. I'm a supporter of that government move. India has 1 million qualified doctors, and we need at least 500,000 more qualified doctors. And there's no way we can produce this many doctors in the next 10 years. And many Indian villages, there are no doctors at all. And we know that when we try to implement the over-the-counter rule, there are no doctors at all. And people are dependent on quacks. So it's better to train people with some knowledge of medicine. Give them at least 6 months. 6 months may not be enough, but at least 6 months, and let them practice some kind of logistic medicine. And it's one way it's better to make them semi-qualified, because we can regulate what they prescribe. Otherwise, they will prescribe including meropenem or any kind of drug. Now we know what they are supposed to prescribe, so it's better to regulate the semi-quacks rather than letting them loose all the way.
Good point, yeah.
Hi, sirs. So just to add to your point, I would also like to say that I think ethics is one of the things which is lacking nowadays. I think the whole medical community suffers because of lack of ethical practice. And I think, of course, you also mentioned that we need to take this topic up of, imparting that ethics, because then in that case, anybody who is trained at least can ethically practice. And also one question I wanted to ask you, Dr. Zarir, that in Mumbai regarding the drug-resistant TB epidemic, so most of the patients also go to private doctors, right, for treatment. So is there a way you feel that the private practitioners can refer the patients for drug-resistant TB, which is a long duration of treatment and a very costly treatment, to the government centers, or in order to regulate the proper regimens which are designed for the patients? Because we come across, unfortunately, even the private chest physicians not prescribing proper regimens for the patients. So how do you think we can ensure this, at least by getting all the chest physicians together, discussions? How do you think we can do this?
Excellent point. So basically India is a democracy, right? Unlike China, unlike Brazil, where every patient with TB has no choice, no matter their income, they go to the government setup. And that is one way, in a sense, it's not democratic, but it's one way of preventing the chaos that we see. In India, you can choose, and the hard figure is that 70 to 80% of TB patients, no matter their income, the well-off patient, you can understand, would rather be seen dead than go into a government DOTS clinic. Sadly, that's a reflection on the clinic, not on the patient. Yeah, but 70 to 80%, even of impoverished patients, even the farmer in Uttar Pradesh, instead of going to the DOTS center, trudging there 5 kilometers away, he will get into a second-class train, spend 48 hours on a train journey, and land up at our doorsteps often. So again, it's a reflection on the poor quality, perceived quality of the government system. And then, of course, some of them seek out the right specialists. Many of them fall into the trap of this multitude of Ayush doctors, for example, who only serve with each prescription to amplify resistance. So in the end, the patient is much worse off. Look, it takes just 2.1 treatment errors to convert a fully drug-sensitive patient to an MDR TB patient. It's that easy. You get the dose wrong, you get the wrong drug combination, and those simple 4 drugs which we mentioned, which would have cured him in 6 months, suddenly get converted to a 2-year, complex, 6-month injectable alone regime, which goes on forever. So, of course, legislation to ensure that the right kind of doctors take on the onus of treating this very demanding disease.
And from private sector, how do you think they can regulate, like, all the chest physicians coming together?
Yes, of course, legislation. And I should say that we've taken a step there because in Hinduja we've set up the first private public TB clinic, MDR TB clinic, the first of its kind in the country. They refused to give me a room in the hospital because they were scared we'd infect the whole hospital. So outside as a standalone, we've got a room where the government and the private sector, instead of looking at each other with suspicion across a chasm, are actually going to try and work together. So I will prescribe the drugs I want, including the newer drugs, which just now only the government can access, and hopefully they will be made available free of charge to our poor patients.
You said that celebrities should propagate and make persons aware of these problems. Now there is one celebrity who has done a very good work. His name is Amitabh Bachchan. Now, Amitabh Bachchan is suffering from a TB of his spine and taking 5 medicines to cut down his pain. Can't he go to the Prime Minister, as a very close friend, I think, and to do this?
I think, in fact, he has been quite vocal. He's a TB ambassador, been nominated a TB ambassador. I've seen his picture on certain government clinic walls, and I think he is being quite vocal about it. But you're right, he's the kind of example who, if he comes out and openly admits, like he has, that he has TB, it goes a long way to reducing the stigmatization around the disease.
Any more questions?
Last question?
Yeah.
Hi.
Please.
I have 2 questions. One is, what is the role the nutrition plays in TB? What is the government policy on this? And what should it be doing? That's the first question. Because I understand certain state governments have a policy of giving some kind of ration, right, to TB patients. Second question is, bedaquiline is 1 or 2 drugs, which are the last resort drugs, right? They are not available to everybody who needs them, right? what role does the government have to play in this? And what is the role of the companies here? Because my understanding here again is that this drug is available as a donation. It's not being manufactured here, nor is it being available at a cheap price. So those are two questions.
Well, nutrition has a pivotal role in TB and getting well from TB. It was the great William Osler who said it's not just the seed, it's also the soil. So the first thing I know when I see a patient coming back on a follow-up, if I can predict that he's going to get well or not going to get well from his drug-resistant TB, will be the weighing scale. If he has gained even a couple of kilos, I know he's on the right trajectory. And if he's lost weight, I know that he's a goner. So it is extremely useful. No big study has shown that you give this kind of supplementation and they will get that much better. But it has a powerful role because it boosts your immune system. The problem is that drugs are so many and make you so nauseous that sometimes you go off your food completely. The problem is sometimes it's a choice between putting food in your tummy and taking the drugs. And they throw away the 2 or 3 which they think tastes the worst. So the nutrition, in short, is very important.
The government policy on this?
The government has given a rather derisory 500 rupees, I think it is. It's better than nothing. How much is it, 500? 500. That's right. Yeah, to patients to add as a nutritional supplement, which is encouraging. They need more than that. They need every possible help they can get at every possible level.
Okay, so one question.
What about bedaquiline?
My understanding is we are going to a very small number of people who need it. Something to do with government policy or something to do with the company?
So bedaquiline is a drug that is as difficult to get as gold, diamonds of any kind, for the patient who really needs it. It is safeguarded very tightly and rigorously by the government because they're scared that if this drug goes the Colistin way, for example, in general antibiotic resistance, there'll be nothing left. But as I gave the example of the Patna girl, sometimes lives are lost, instead of saving the patient. So it's difficult to access. We accessed it because the company had a compassionate scheme where if the physician wrote to the company, a group of experts somewhere in Europe would decide that this patient needs the drug. So that was our back door into getting bedaquiline for large numbers of our patients, and we published extensively our experience with the drug. And even given late in the disease, when they were goners and had no other drug really left to them, we could salvage about 75 to 80% of patients. So imagine what a new combination of drugs can do. But it is very difficult to access, and the government just now only can access the drug, give the drug.
Yeah. Sir, just I wanted to ask you one question. Actually, Mumbai is already high burden with DSTB also and now DRTB.
Mumbai is not just high burden, it is the epicenter of the MDR TB crisis in this country.
And here slum area is very also high. Around 70% people still staying in slum area with densely. So there were some people tried, some NGOs tried to do ACF activities, active case finding in slum area to reduce the gap of diagnosis, to achieve early diagnosis and high number of diagnoses, actually, people who have symptoms. But it is not happening in sustainable manner. So there is, I feel there is a huge need of doing such activities to do early case detection, but we are not doing that.
As I said, forget eradicating TB in India. By 2025, if anyone could eradicate in Dharavi, which is a generator of MDR TB in our country, and many of your drivers and staffs and servants come from there, remember, that alone would be really worthwhile. I don't see that happening. We see so many of our patient populations coming from these pockets of deprivation with the most drug-resistant forms, and of course spreading it in the community. Eraj has the last word. He's there.
Yeah, that's the last question.
Yes,
yeah.
I have a question. You have already said the extent of the problem obviously is very large.
He's a lawyer, I should say. He's a lawyer from school. Yes, Eraj.
You've already said that the extent of the problem is very large as far as TB is concerned. You've also said that if a doctor makes mistakes in regimes 2.1 times, simple TB would become multi-drug resistant TB. What steps can we take to ensure that every doctor, it's one disease after all, what steps can we take to ensure that every doctor, even a practicing doctor, a GP or perhaps a specialist, has to mandatorily go through a program for administration or dealing with TB patients? So the errors that a doctor makes are reduced, and the number of MDR patients that automatically come to you would hopefully fall. Now, you can't mandatorily tell any patient that you have to go to a DOTS program because it's a democracy. But surely the medical community can do something to ensure that every single doctor who practices undergoes, irrespective of the length of practice he's done, undergoes a mandatory program to deal with TB. So can't something like that be done?
So that's a very good point. And the tragedy is that guidelines exist. It's not as though we don't have guidelines. All the medical students here should know, because it's a standard regime, how to treat a drug-sensitive patient, how to treat an MDR, at least in a basic way, not the more complicated cases, right? So let me end with this nice study that we did in Dharavi. Because we saw that was the generator of TB, the TB patients that we so often saw. We went to Dharavi in the guise of giving a talk there, which I did do, but I had my eager juniors and residents distribute to 100 doctors. It was a doctor's talk there. They came because of the free lunch, I'm sure. And we gave 100 doctors there a standard questionnaire, and it had just one question on it. How would you treat a patient with drug-resistant TB weighing 45 kilos? Now, every medical student and every doctor in this room should know what to do. It's fairly standard. It's there in the books. It's there in the guidelines. Out of 100 doctors, we got 94 different regimes and only 4 correct regimes. And when we analyzed the 94 regimes, 90% of them would only have converted an MDR patient to an XDR TB patient. So it was a very simple 1-2-page study, but very often cited as an example of the big gaps in our prescribing knowledge. We know what to do, but we just don't bother to do it. We're cavalier about everything. So Abdul, 2025, you think still?
I think we're having concluding remarks right now, so this will be your concluding. Yeah. Okay,
the
fine.
right doctor. You know, I practice infectious disease. I treat TB as well. I treat MDR TB. But 2 years ago, I had a very difficult to treat patient, you know, resistant to almost all drugs. The patient asked me, what should I do? You know, I did a remarkable decision. And 2 years after that, recently the patient came to me, touched my feet and told me, Doc, you are my God. You know what I did? I referred the patient 2 years ago to Zarir. It really is. Yeah, and the patient is cured.
Okay, it's very, very nice to end on that positive note. So yes, the super bugs are there, but we do have superheroes like Amitabh Bachchan and Dr. Zarir and Dr. Ghafur on our side. So let's hope that when we do this program next year, we'll have some more positive results to talk about. Thanks to the Asia Society for having us and having this topic. Thank you.